Hello, welcome to this lecture that is entitled From Morals to Mandates, How Ethics Shapes Society. This is a continuation. We just had a lecture on ethics. Then you would have stopped, done the exercise entitled Identify the Ethical Dilemma or Ethical Dilemmas. And so this is a continuation. In that previous exercise, we were talking about what ethics is. We were talking about the fact that ethics is both about defining what is good, what good is, as well as the branch of ethics that applies it and says, how do we get people to do good? How do we get people to be good? And so you saw this image in the last lecture as well. And that's got ethics down there at the root of the tree. And what we're going to really talk about now in more detail is how we use policy and how we use laws and norms to try to get people to do that good and be that good so that we live in a society that upholds the values that we want it to uphold, does the good that we have defined. So I have one simple learning objective. By the end of this lecture, I want you to be able to identify how laws, norms, and policies play a role in cybersecurity. And for the most part, we're going to focus on how they play a role positively in cybersecurity. But it is true that laws, norms, and policies can have unintended consequences. They can conflict, they can contradict, and have sometimes a negative role. I've given you these two images. You've seen them before in the class. To me, both of these images are really relevant to this section of this lecture. The first is the NIST cybersecurity framework on the left-hand side. So laws, norms, and policies are a really important part of governance. And sometimes the laws, norms, and policies are in order to protect. Sometimes they're in order to detect. Sometimes they might be specific to respond or recover. So when I think through these topics, I see this image in my head, and I just wanted to offer it up here to you again so that hopefully you will carry this image in your head as you listen and then work through the exercise. So the other image is the defense in depth image. And I know that you saw this first, I think, in module 1, and then really worked with it in the homework assignment on creating a defense in depth plan at the end of module 3. Hopefully you revisited, kept defense in depth at the forefront of your mind through everything in module 4. And so here it is again. But putting it here in this lecture in module 5, it has a little different connotation. So up to now, we've largely been thinking about defense in depth in terms of a single organization. And now what I want you to think about is at a more macro level, at a societal level. So societies are composed of individuals, but not just individuals. They're composed of other entities. And what do I mean when I say other entities? Let me use another really broad term and then try to define it. Society is composed of organizations. So when I say organizations, I could mean the entire private sector. When I say the entire private sector, I could mean both privately held and publicly traded companies. I could be defining the private sector by size. I could mean small businesses, medium-sized businesses, large businesses. I could mean multinational organizations. I could classify the private sector organizations by the industry sector that they're in. Are they in finance? Are they in healthcare? Are they in tourism? Are they in manufacturing? Are they in agriculture? Right? So all of those ways of thinking about organizations within the private sector are useful. And we do specifically sometimes create laws to apply to large multinationals, to apply to large businesses. We create laws that scaffold, that build differently and treat small businesses still with some expectations, but slightly different expectations than large multinationals. We have laws such as, and we'll talk about, HIPAA is mentioned later in this lecture. I don't think Gramm-Leach-Bliley is mentioned, which is a law that has cybersecurity dimensions to it in the financial sector. HIPAA, which is the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. Many of you probably know HIPAA from going to the doctor's office, is in the financial sector. So zoom way back out with me for a minute. I said private sector, and then I started classifying things within the private sector. Let's zoom out and let's contrast private sector to public sector, right? So public sector could include government, but public sector could also include nonprofits. You know, I have a nonprofit. I have a really teeny tiny nonprofit. But I used to work at Purdue University, which is a very large nonprofit. So educational institutions are nonprofits in the public sector. But so are things like churches and faith-based organizations. Some healthcare organizations are still nonprofits in the public sector. What else? Youth services, a whole myriad of organizations that would fall under that classification. Professional societies, right at the very beginning of this class, we talked about CSEC, the accreditation standard. And then I talked to you about the supplement to identify what would go in a foundations of cybersecurity class, which is the basis for the class that you're in. And you might remember I said to you the professional society that puts out these standards is called ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery. So all of those professional societies are in the nonprofit public sector. And in module 1, I think lesson 1, we talked about our reliance across all different kinds of organizations, private, public, nonprofit, our societal reliance on cybersecurity, on digital systems, and therefore on cybersecurity, right? And so what I'm getting at here is that laws and norms and policies play a role in societal defense in depth. They are meant to help us as a society protect in a macro way the values that we uphold and the systems that we rely on. So I want you to try to carry these two images with you as we talk through in this short lecture laws and norms and policies. And I do want to say we talk just a little bit about policies here, but we pick policies back up in the next lesson in this module, whereas this is the only time that we're going to really dive deep into laws and norms and their relationship to ethics. So a few definitions. I feel like you probably know all of these, but anytime you're getting ready to think about something, it's always good to remind yourself, first of all, what you already know. Laws are formalized rules. Laws are established by governments and institutions like that have the power, the authority to create laws, such as Congress. And they enforce our ethics, the things that we think are good, the values that we are trying to uphold, through regulations, through rights, and through penalties. In contrast, social norms are expectations that play an important and a big role in shaping behavior. And they get carried out through things like cultural traditions, peer influence, societal pressure, enforced through things like reputation and recognition. And recognition, has a good connotation to it. So frequently recognition is a good thing. But if it's shaming, then that's another form of recognition. That's a social pressure. And for the purposes of our course here, we're going to call policies internal rules or guidelines established, implemented, and enforced by an organization. And you remember, I'm taking that very broad and inclusive view of what it means to be an organization. Sorry, I think my voice is a little gravelly today. I'm fighting my allergies. So let's look through this table. Here you see laws, norms, and policies in the first row. And I think we've already done the definitions. We did that on the last slide. So let's look through the next row where it says scope, right? Laws are usually enacted and passed and enforced by states or nations, or sometimes they're international, right? So they apply within a jurisdiction. There's some sort of boundary within a jurisdiction. Norms, in contrast, can be global, they can be sectoral, and by sectoral, that word can take on a lot of different connotations. And they apply, one of the good things about them is that they apply a little bit more without regard to borders, right? They can transcend borders more fluidly and easily. And policies, because we've defined them as being within an organization, even though we know that an organization can be a little teeny tiny nonprofit, a little teeny tiny for-profit, or a large multinational with lots of offices and subdivisions. But they apply within the whatever boundaries apply to that organization. So laws are enforced, we know this, through courts, through regulators, through law enforcement, right? There's an enforcement mechanism that is also more formal. Whereas norms, as I already said, are enforced through peer pressure, reputation, and diplomacy. Doesn't mean that the enforcement of norms is weaker. It is more informal, but it can actually be quite strong, as I think you and I can imagine. And then, of course, within an organization, policies are enforced internally, whatever means they choose. Management oversight, could be technical controls that are used to enforce cybersecurity policies, or it could be actual HR processes. I feel like we've talked about the row on jurisdiction. So let's look at the next row down called source. So I think you understand that there's a source for the law. It could be a legislature, it could be a parliament, it could be a regulatory agency that has been conferred the authority to issue the law, to enforce the law. Norms tend to come to us from bodies. Could be a professional society. In the next lesson, we're going to look at codes of conduct, which are a form of norm, and those do come from professional societies. Here, we're talking about international bodies. um, we're going to talk a little bit more about international bodies and cross jurisdictional boundaries in just a few minutes. Could be industry coalitions, could be civil society. And then within an organization, it could be the governance team, could be the president, could be the chief information security officer, could be your legal compliance officers who are trying to make sure that the policies you've created within your organization comply with the laws that have been imposed upon your organization. I'm looking at the row now called binding. I feel like we've talked about a lot of things here as well. So let me just talk for a minute about examples. Because in this course, we're not going to look at a lot of laws in depth. As opposed to looking at various laws, I prefer to kind of give you a framework so that as you encounter laws or norms or policies, you can understand the role it's playing in trying to promote cybersecurity, in trying to promote cybersecurity governance, in trying to promote protection or detection, response or recovery, and as I said earlier, ultimately in trying to provide some sort of defense in depth. So we're not going to go deeply into any one particular law. But if you're looking over at the examples laws cell, you'll see GDPR, right? That's a European Union privacy law. HIPAA, I mentioned it earlier. It's called the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. It came about when we really started promoting electronic health records in the United States. You might remember way back in Module 1, when we were talking about our reliance on digital systems. I think I gave a statistic that said that 95% of health organizations have now accommodated and incorporated electronic health records. That was by law. There was a law that incentivized and then required health organizations to implement electronic health records. That was so you and I could see a doctor anywhere, right? I live in Indiana, so that if I was on vacation in Wyoming and I needed to go to the doctor, they could see my health records. But then once we started transmitting health records over the wire, the risks to our privacy increased. And so HIPAA was in response to that increased risk. CFAA is the Consumer Fraud and Abuse Act. If you're interested in that particular law, you can look it up. Another interesting one, which is relatively recent, another European Union directive, NIS2, is a shared directive across all of their countries of how they're going to protect critical infrastructure. So if you're interested in that, you can look that one up as well. I wanted to give also a couple of examples of norms. So you see in Examples, norms, coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So among ethical hackers, cybersecurity researchers, people who are hot, paid to find vulnerabilities and to report them, and then vendors, there is an understanding of what is acceptable practice for disclosing those vulnerabilities. And that acceptable practice, people are expected to uphold it if you want to be considered, one of the good guys or gals, because it is what is perceived to be the practice that promotes the most amount of good while mitigating harm. So that's an example of a norm. If you're interested in how that norm functions, you can look that up on your own, but that's an example of one. A second example is the non-targeting of civilian infrastructure. So this is more of an international norm. And I think the best way that I can draw an analogy to this, I'm home at night, I turn on the TV and I see a news story about some kinesthetic conflict where one country has bombed the civilian infrastructure of another country. Could be a hospital, could be a school. And there's a lot of shock and outrage, right? Because that's considered to be really over the red line of acceptable behavior. We have that same norm in cybersecurity. We have the same norm that we understand we can have adversaries, but by and large, it's wrong to target civilian infrastructure when you use cybersecurity offensively. And then in sharp contrast, it feels like sharp contrast to me, examples of policies would be acceptable use policies, incident response plans, access control policies. I feel like you probably could add a lot of examples in this particular cell because by and large, that's been a big focus of our what we've talked about throughout this class. So you should get the gist there. I'm not going to say much more about the last row, excuse me, called role in cybersecurity, because I think that I cover some of this in the upcoming slides. Just a few more things, and then we'll be done with this short lecture. Laws, I know I'm repeating myself, but I think this is worth repeating. Laws function as codified ethics, right? They reflect the things that we value, or they attempt to reflect the things that we value, whether it's through a regulation or through a right, through an incentive, through a punishment. It attempts to embody what we value in a manifest way. So I just said whether it's a right or, a regulation. So here's an example. Privacy laws, GDPR. CCPA is a California law. So I on purpose picked a state law here to remind you that laws can be enacted by states as well as by nations, as well as by federations of nations, to protect rights, to protect our rights. Laws function sometimes to deter harm. That protect function within the NIST CSF. And I was recently reading about this Budapest Convention on Cybercrime through the Council of Europe, an international treaty that attempts to harmonize their cybercrime laws across nations. Hacking, fraud, and child exploitation. The more that they can harmonize their various laws, the better they are positioned to be able to deter harm. And then I think probably to respond across jurisdictional borders when harm is in fact done. Sometimes laws try to establish accountability. Who's going to be responsible if harm happens? You see here it says state data breach disclosure laws. Probably most of you have at some point gotten a letter in the mail that said, we had your data and it was breached. You're part of a data breach. And these laws are required. We don't currently have a federal data breach disclosure law. The reason for that goes all the way back to railroads in the United States, believe it or not. When we became a union, and as you know, because you're all in education, education remained a state right, and it was under the control of states. At that time, so was commerce. And it wasn't until the railroad really became prevalent and we had rail cars being built. For example, Maryland was a state that built a lot of rail cars. And they would string those cars together and put them on a railroad track and send them across state lines. And then they'd carry whatever they were carrying across state lines. And let's say that rail car got to Iowa and the people in Iowa needed to manipulate that rail car. They needed to unhitch it and they needed to attach it to a new set of rail cars to send another direction. Well, it turns out that some of those rail cars weren't being built with the kind of safety mechanisms that they needed. And people in other states were suffering from loss of limb and sometimes loss of life. And that's when we started to think that we needed interstate commerce regulations. But commerce, by and large, is still a state purview in many ways. Just as economic development is a state purview, the governor, the state is usually responsible for having a viable economy. And so we see that spillover when we talk about this state data breach disclosure laws. We still have a patchwork. Last time I checked, I think it was 48 states had data breach disclosure laws. We still had 2 states that didn't. And they vary quite a bit. And the state data breach disclosure laws aren't just interesting because they're state laws and not federal laws. They're interesting because they're really transparency laws. So as much as we would like to be able to hold, for example, Target or Home Depot or Marriott, we would like to hold them accountable and we would like to punish them for a data breach. It's important to remember that they're victims too. I know that they have all of our data, and so we feel like a victim, but they're victims too. And frequently, as I alluded to in the lecture on ethics, they're victims from nation-state actors or from organized crime. And it might not be appropriate or feasible to expect an organization to have the wherewithal to fight a nation state or to fight large-scale organized crime. And so to try to strike a balance, we've passed these state data breach disclosure laws. And they're sunshine laws is what they are. They go along the lines. It was Warren Brandeis who kind of invented the idea of sunshine laws that said what we need to do when we have an ill that we think is really hard to enforce, we need to shine the light on it. We need to let all of our citizens know about it, and then they can make good decisions. And one of the most common areas of sunshine laws is in labeling laws on food, labeling laws on cigarettes, are sunshine laws to tell you this is what's in this. And this could be, in the case of cigarettes, it tells you this is bad for you. In the case of food laws, labeling laws, we haven't gotten to a point yet where we say there's ultra processed ingredients in here that are not good for you. But I think we're creeping up on that. We've started talking about ultra processed ingredients. So the way that the data breach disclosure laws attempt to establish accountability is through almost through a norm, right? Through causing the company to expose itself and hoping that that will create a form of social pressure that asks them and precipitates them to increase their cybersecurity program, their cybersecurity governance: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. So on the right-hand side, there's a couple of things that are always important to remember about laws. They do lag, they're slow. Technological change is fast, and technological change always gives rise to a whole bunch of ethical questions that come about just as fast. There's a lot of volatility there, but laws are slow. And so that's one of the reasons why social norms and organizational policies help fill some of those gaps. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of gaps, but it's why we can't count on laws alone. Secondly, laws set minimum standards. Laws usually don't help us realize all of the values that we're trying to uphold. It's a low bar, not the high bar. Third, legal compliance does not guarantee ethical conduct. I think we could all think of many examples in our lives where somebody has followed the letter of the law, but has violated or not embodied the spirit of the law. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. Enforcement can be hard. We just spent a lot of time talking about why we have sunshine laws, because they're appropriate for areas that are hard to enforce. But even when you can enforce something, it can be expensive. And we oftentimes don't want to bear the expense for large-scale enforcement. I think everybody here should understand this next bullet. Laws can be full of competing ethical values. We already foreshadowed that in the first lecture, and then you dove into it in identifying the ethical dilemma exercise. So you should appreciate this one fully now. Second to last, cyber systems cut right across time and space, just like that. So as opposed to physical systems that really can be defined by geographical boundaries, Cyberspace is not like that, and it presents some interesting, intricate nuances and challenges in trying to reconcile cultural and global differences. Unintended consequences. There are always unintended consequences with laws, and there are always loopholes. So the two more slides, I think, on norms. I'm not going to talk too much more about, sorry, I went the wrong way. I'm not going to talk too much more about organizational policies in this lecture because we pick back up and talk about organizational policies in the next lesson. So again, a reminder, norms are the embodiment of ethical judgments, right? They're things that we create to try to get people to do good and be good so that we together uphold the values that we're trying to uphold. You know, the second bullet, we've talked about this. They don't need legal enforcement. They rely on social pressure. And what I'd like you to look at is this funny poster on the right-hand side. This is a consolidation of a poster series that came out of the University of Michigan. You can kind of see it cited down there in the bottom right-hand corner in the small print. The Chief Information Security Officer, Virginia Rizmierski, at the University of Michigan, worked with some students. I think they were maybe in linguistics. This is like 2000, 2001, to try to create a cybersecurity campaign that would use norms. And the campaign they came up with is that passwords are like underwear. And so each of these was actually a different poster, and they rolled the campaign out across time. So it had the catchy phrases, passwords are like underwear, change yours often. Passwords are like underwear, don't share them with friends. Passwords are like underwear, be mysterious. Passwords are like underwear, the longer the better. And finally, don't leave yours lying around. So I think this is a really great example of how norms are initiated and then perpetuated. And of course, they use humor because people respond and receive messages that are delivered with humor and then respond to them, right? Norms do emerge from our collective values, our collective behaviors, and they're fairly fluid to evolve. I already talked about the fact that they can cut across boundaries, but just as laws tend to be slow to respond to technological and ethical dilemmas that arise because of technological change, norms can arise much more fluidly, and therefore they can fill gaps that we need filled. So common and immediate, right? They're everywhere. Norms are everywhere, and that ubiquity makes them powerful. That ubiquity, they're everywhere. Not only are they everywhere, they're really constant, right? We all, without even knowing it, are responding to norms every day. I already talked about this. They're valuable because of their responsiveness, because of their ability to evolve quickly, right? And I've given you examples as we've talked. Cybersecurity disclosure, vulnerability disclosure, we talked about that. Password hygiene, we just talked about that, right? And my goodness, you can't be on any kind of social media these days without seeing that we are working hard to try to establish norms about what constitutes responsible AI use. Questions are abundant. Opinions are abundant. And attempts at norms are coming out of that. And of course, norms are their pressure. They send signals all the time about what's right and what's wrong. And I just wanted to end by saying that they're so important because they really point us to what causes a loss of trust, what causes a loss of reputation, what causes a loss of legitimacy, right? And if you're hearing themes from module 1 in your head, that's great, because I am hearing them too. And those themes, I think we've attempted to weave throughout this course. And if you've been following along, then you can truly appreciate the role that laws and norms play in trying to establish trust in cybersecurity. So now you're ready for the exercise entitled Laws versus Norms in Cybersecurity. Thank you.